Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. That kind introduction. Thank you to Betty, wherever she is, for the wonderful invitation to be part. Betty and I actually met roughly over a year ago in Colorado, and the more I learned about TCD, the more I realized what a special community this is and what an amazing person she is to have carried this movement forward. So it's really wonderful to be with you today here in Gainesville. My first time in Gainesville, so I'm enjoying myself thoroughly so far. I wanted to talk to you today about an initiative that we've been working on for a long time at, how do I advance from here? Yeah. So I came to the II by way of kind of a roundabout way. My background is in plant science and natural resource management. And then I started to focus on climate governance and disaster risk reduction. I've worked in the public sector, I've worked in the private sector, and also with research, and most recently in establishing research support services in Panama, where I've lived for altogether now 15 years. And I came to the II roughly 4 years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, when they needed someone to start this science, technology, and policy fellowship program. And I have to say that when I found out about the II and what they were doing, I really went through this revelation, like, this kind of research has been happening all this time and nobody told me. Like, I ran away from grad school because I thought I had to be stuck in a lab and I wanted to be out in the world. And come to find out, for me and what my passions are, the transdisciplinary approach to science, scientific research, working with people, working to generate impact with the work that we're doing, is very much resonates with the kind of science that I see that is needed in this world. That is not to say that I don't believe in basic science. I think they are both crucial components to the research machine, so I support both wholeheartedly. But for me, coming across the II, it was like I found my people and I found my calling. So the II, as Anna said, is an intergovernmental organization. It was established 30 years ago through an agreement. So we're a treaty organization with 19 member countries. So I work for these 19 countries here and their focal points, which are government appointees. And then on top of that, we have, which is basically the National Secretariats of Science, the Ministries of Environments, some universities, yeah, I think that's usually the Ministries of Science and the National Secretaries of Science and Universities are typically our focal points within each of the countries. So we have a direct line to the decision makers and the policymakers. In addition to the fact that we finance scientific research that meets these needs. So our mandate by the agreement, which was signed by these 19 countries 30 years ago, is that our job is to promote regional cooperation for transdisciplinary research on aspects of global change. The agreement technically says interdisciplinary. At that time, we didn't say transdisciplinary, but we've adopted that term. Pursue on a regional scale that research which cannot be pursued by an individual state or nation, which really also resonates with me because we do not shy away from the big, complex, wicked problems. Our projects and research is focused on these wicked issues, wicked problems that not one single country can address by itself. And our job is to raise scientific programs and projects on the basis of their regional relevance and scientific merit, and really protect and promote scientific excellence and the free and open exchange of knowledge. So building on this sustainable cooperation across different sectors, academic, private, and diplomatic spheres, is something that in Latin America really needs to do to tackle the environmental issues that we're facing today. If we look again at the mandate of the II, we were perfectly positioned then to launch this Science Diplomacy Center just 2 years ago. Science and innovation diplomacy is it's evolving, but asymmetrically worldwide. As we see, by and large, these movements coming from the global north, and the global south is very fragmented in its response to science diplomacy and innovation diplomacy, specifically in Latin America. The region's science and innovation diplomacy initiatives are gaining momentum within certain institutions like foreign ministries, national science secretariats, universities, research institutions, but by and large, it hasn't yet reached the involvement of the private sector or the public opinion, who really doesn't know what science diplomacy is. An important example of this that I wanted to share with you was a project that some of my fellows did, actually, on a policy analysis on how science diplomacy plays a crucial role in addressing these asymmetries by serving as a tool and framework for negotiations between North and South America. So the framework they propose will reduce costs, enhance mutual benefits, and ensure that all stakeholders, from producers to consumers, particularly participate in the equitable distribution of rewards and burdens. So they're looking at the supply chain of lithium, which, as many of you know, the lithium triangle, in addition to Australia, is focused in South America and countries like Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And they're all in different stages of the lithium supply chain. So their policy framework was to look at how can we introduce similar supply chain frameworks that have been used in agro-industry and forestry, like with certification programs, and apply it to the mining of lithium industry, and to have that inform science diplomacy and relationships between countries along the entire supply chain. And what we find is that there, of course, are huge knowledge gaps in how that lithium is being managed, processed, mined, shipped. And that is an interesting entry point for researchers and experts to gather that information and then inform the policy and decision makers to introduce these novel frameworks for policy that would be more equitable between the whole user line. So that way we have benefits in the global north with more electric vehicles, and then also in the global south with the mining of these precious resources. So let's back up a little bit. And talk about science diplomacy in general. So in the past 15 years or so, we've witnessed an emergence of science diplomacy both as a formalized mechanism in government and also as a field of research. A number of factors continue to drive this trend, but most important is the recognition that more and more major challenges are international in nature, and that science and its applications are part of the cause as well as the cure. So as a result, while much of the international science regime is still focused on discovery, there is increasingly need for the integration of science cooperation in international relations. Of course, there's a long history between science and diplomacy. From the Cold War, when international relations were completely broken between countries, we've had scientific collaboration that continued. And that's something that we build on when the rest of the diplomatic relations break down. I live in Panama, as I mentioned. The entire history of the Panama Canal has its roots in scientific, technological, and innovative collaboration. I'll put collaboration in this there. But it has had a lasting legacy on, for example, infectious disease research, where we have institutions that were formed with the construction of the Panama Canal who continue to do research and leading research in infectious diseases, and who are now also doing research on what are the most pressing challenges of the Panama Canal today, which are drought due to climate change, and also issues For example, I just pulled this article. This has been popping up in various news sources recently. This was just in the Times a month ago, about saltwater intrusion that's occurring since the expansion of the canal. Researchers from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, or STRI, have been tracking the effects that saltwater intrusion is having on the freshwater species of fish that are in Lago Gatun, the Gatun Lake, which is part of the Panama Canal, which is freshwater. And now they are very concerned, and the Ministry of the Environment and the Panama Canal Authority is trying to work with the researchers to get involved to see what kind of intervention needs to happen, because they're very concerned about invasive species like the candy-striped lionfish, which is invasive and also venomous, actually passing from one ocean to the other. And what I especially liked about this article was how it highlighted that the researchers from the Smithsonian have been in contact with a researcher based in Tel Aviv, who has been researching similar problems in the Suez Canal. And that's where the scientific collaboration takes place. And then there's momentum to advocate as researchers what are the interventions that the governments need to take, which are sometimes drastic and rather costly, but they're based on real information, important information. So there have been numerous efforts to define science diplomacy, and I admit most of them come from the global north. Though Brazil has been a leader in science diplomacy for quite some time, and that's something that we're really trying to push for at the IAI, is how we can come up with and have ownership over the term ourselves from the global south. But the prevailing typology of science diplomacy is from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which frames the relationship between science, technology, and innovation, STI ecosystems, and the state through concepts like diplomacy for science, science in diplomacy, and science for diplomacy. So diplomacy for science is when diplomacy works to facilitate science. For example, the construction of the Particle Accelerator Large Hadron Collider at CERN that took 100 countries working together to build. That was an example of science for diplomacy. Science in diplomacy is the use of science advice in foreign policy by the state, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, with ad hoc advisory committees popping up in different countries, which were used to inform the decisions that were made nationally, but also their country's external reaction to a complex public health issue. And then finally, science for diplomacy is when science is used to provide and enhance relationships between states. This establishes an extensive network of cooperation, which can become a political asset for a state. So soft power, these terms about soft power and hard power and smart power are common in diplomacy and are concepts that help us understand the dynamics between the different actors in the global arena. So while power can be described by the extent of its influence over others, science serves as a versatile tool that can be applied across the entire spectrum of power. So traditionally, aeronautical science, nuclear science has very tight connections to hard power. In this context, science diplomacy emerges as a key concept for understanding the intricate dynamics at play. And who are the traditional stakeholders in science diplomacy? We start with the state, for example, the bureaucratic mobilization of scientific expertise in courting to reach a priority or an interest of a state. So the state. Many emerging countries invest in their science, technology, and innovation, their STI ecosystem, to improve their international image, to attract talent from abroad, and to use science as a tool for economic and social and sustainable development. I know that's the case in Panama. That was the case in the United States many, many, many years ago as a tool for economic development, and it continues to be, well, for the attraction of talent. We have subnational entities as well that are important stakeholders. So there's states, provinces, cities, and we can see this, for example, in the C40 movement of mayors who are coordinating actions to respond to the climate crisis around the world within their different cities. And then you have international organizations like the UN system, or organizations like the II, which serve to convene, to mediate, to negotiate, to serve as these boundary institutions between all of the actors. And I think the II serves as this boundary organization. I think that's a really crucial role to play as an institution. And I emphasize the fact that these are all institutionalized in order to be part of the science diplomacy ecosystem. And then finally, the scientific institutions and researchers like yourselves, collaborating on research at an international level. You are part of this ecosystem. By doing your research in different countries, you're helping build up this science STI ecosystem here and abroad that could and should be pulled on to help advance national interests or to collaborate across borders, especially if we're working on issues like climate change, biodiversity laws, conservation efforts, for example. So governments, subnational entities, intergovernmental organizations, and scientific actors contribute to inform policy through science in this scenario. And each of these actors brings their own perspectives, their own resources, their own objectives, which can create a rather complex landscape of interactions and influence. The involvement of diverse stakeholders, as some of you may know, not only complicates the diplomatic landscape, but it can also really enrich it. And that's where we're working right now. We're trying to really promote a diversity of stakeholders participating in the room and knowing that it's going to be complex and everyone's coming to the table with their different biases and agendas, but how can we use what each of us brings to the table to enrich the conversation, and in our case, provide evidence that will inform the decisions that will ultimately be made. And that's through different forms of science advice. So Peter Gluckman is one of the, he's a researcher with INCSA out of New Zealand and has written a lot about the science policy interface and this concept of knowledge brokers. And there are different typologies then of science advice, which I find to be really interesting. So you can have a scientist who's working on a very technical capacity, regulatory, they're part of deliberative processes and negotiations, for example, or they're an informal advisor. So the way you plug into the system can be very different based on your own skills and your own interests and your own passions. And these types of advice play critical roles in forming this ecosystem, again, particularly in times of crisis and emergency. I do feel it's important to talk about the duality between innovation diplomacy and science diplomacy. So science diplomacy generally fosters cooperation among nations to address global challenges through scientific collaboration. It often operates within the framework of foreign policy, involving both state and non-state actors in a strategic, institutionalized manner. On the other hand, innovation diplomacy brings the competitive aspect of market-driven innovation into the diplomatic sphere, aligning scientific advancements with economic strategies to enhance national competitiveness and sustainability. Innovation is a continuing process of developing new products and solutions driven by the collaboration of various stakeholders. Whether in the private or public sector or through partnerships, innovation depends on hearing diverse perspectives, including those of newly recognized actors. In this case, we're adding to our ecosystem the role of consumers and the role of investors. So that's a unique capacity for, or unique distinction for innovation diplomacy. These innovation ecosystems emphasize the importance of cooperation between different actors, and there's actually this term that I love, it's called coopetition between actors. This approach not only allows for collaboration within national borders, but extends globally, enabling more dynamic and diverse exchanges. We're seeing this play out with AI right now, and that is innovation diplomacy. That's not science diplomacy, because we see different stakeholders taking part in that conversation. And it's a distinct difference that I like to draw between the two. Because innovation diplomacy operates at the intersection of foreign policy and innovation, aiming to use diplomatic tools to strengthen a country's innovation ecosystem. What stands out is that innovation diplomacy is not just about advancing scientific knowledge, like science diplomacy. It is deeply tied to commercial interests and economic development. And its main goal is to connect innovative ideas and technological solutions with markets and investors who can drive their implementation. And it requires countries to create environments that attract investment and support economic growth, often through collaboration between the public and private sectors. We see this playing out right now, actually, in Panama, in relation to the CHIPS Act. There are some countries outside of the US that have been identified to collaborate with the US to receive funding to support the supply chain of microchips and semiconductors as part of this movement. I am not sure how that currently stands, so I am speaking as if the world has continued. But it has been interesting to see how this has pushed Panama to really put a strategy for and innovate to support their innovation ecosystem, which is a whole new set of stakeholders and players. For example, on a national level, we need to now talk about international technology transfer or engaging with scientific diasporas to foster collaboration. Where are the experts on these? They might not be in country. We need to bring them from abroad, or we need to bring them back to the country. On a global scale, it includes efforts to harmonize regulatory frameworks, enhance intellectual property protection, and ensure smoother international cooperation. So I wanted to give you some examples of science diplomacy in global environmental change in Latin America. I'm really proud to share these examples with you because this is part of a work that we've been doing, again, to contextualize the conversation of science diplomacy coming from the Global South with examples from the Global South. So this first one is on conservation and CMAR. So conservation strategies, as many of you know in this room, are traditionally designed and enforced at a national scale. But due to their transboundary nature, they need to encompass the full extension of the ecosystems, which do not respect boundaries, political boundaries, as well as, for example, wildlife migratory pathways that also don't respect the division between Colombia and Panama or the United States and Mexico, for example. This leads to international regulations and tools to protect, in this example, marine areas and resources. So the Tropical Eastern Pacific Marine Corridor, CEMAR, por sus siglas en español, is a voluntary regional cooperation mechanism created by Ecuador, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Panama to manage and protect one of the world's most productive and biodiverse oceans, which extends from the Galapagos Islands to Cocos Island, encompassing critical regions like Martello, Gorgona, and Coiba, as seen here. Despite the absence of a coherent, overarching regional ocean governance framework, during the last 2 decades, CMAR has provided an unprecedented basis for scientists and diplomats to work hand in hand under a joint governance structure, and their governance structure is here. The origins of CMAR can be tracked back to 1997, when formal diplomatic approaches from both Costa Rica and Ecuador started to discuss their overlapping marine areas, which are these economic extension zones, which there are so many laws, but extend to 200 kilometers off the border of a country. And obviously in these areas, there's overlapping. So that's what brought these states together in the initial stages to talk to each other. At the Sustainable Development Summit in 2002, the president of Ecuador put forward the idea of a strategic alliance between the 4 countries that would work with civil society and international organizations such as Conservation International, IUCN, UNESCO, UNDP, This initiative was formalized in 2004 with the signing of the San Jose Statement. The most prevalent challenges that CMAR is confronting today include over and illegal fishing, as well as coral reef bleaching, in addition to climate change, other climate change strategies. But the overfishing and illegal fishing is a big issue and has also been in the news recently on how these countries can enforce these marine protected areas. So here you have the diplomatic efforts that were used to create CMAR, which is Diplomacy for Science. And then the expansion of the corridor based on scientific data showcases science for diplomacy. And additionally, the governance and management of CMAR demonstrates science in diplomacy, where scientific insights are crucial in shaping policy decisions. And I'm really excited about CMAR because we're going to have a fellow with them this coming cohort. This is another example of a conflict, actually, that happened between Uruguay and Argentina. I should ask, is there anyone familiar with this case in the room from Argentina, Uruguay? No? Yeah, okay. This happened around 2006. This is a great example because in this case, scientific knowledge became both a tool and for cooperation and a source of controversy over this transboundary dispute. So this is around the approval of 2 paper pulp mills in 2006 by the Uruguayan government in the city of Fray Ventos on the Uruguayan bank of the Uruguay River. That led to social and political turmoil to the Argentinians that lived downriver. The 2 mills, which were owned by foreign enterprises, represented a huge induction of foreign direct investment into the Uruguayan economy, which was why Uruguay went forward with the decision. Nevertheless, it would also potentially generate environmental and health damage to the population of the Argentinian city Gualeguaychú, which is downriver on the other side of the bank. In this case, there was also another factor, another stakeholder, which was the involvement of civil society, particularly through the movement of the Environmental Citizens Assembly of Gualeguaychú, which resulted in over 40,000 people gathering to block the bridge that crossed the Uruguay River between Argentina and Uruguay. And this protest had members from both sides of the country. But this demonstrates how important grassroots movements are in influencing diplomatic and, in this case, also legal outcomes. Because this dispute went from bilateral negotiations, which didn't work, to then brought before Mercosur, also didn't work, and then it was kicked up to The Hague at the International Court of Justice. Scientific advisory committees were established on both sides to try to mediate between the parties. And then those scientific advisory committees started to fight because they didn't agree on methodologies, on data collection methods, and interpretations of the data, which just fueled the dispute even further, which underscores the limitations even of science alone in mitigating conflicts, which means we need science, but we also need high-level political engagement and cooperative governance structures. And I'm looking at, these mechanisms that bring it to higher levels for mediation when it's the bilateral negotiations fall apart. So in 2010, remember these were built in 2006, the court ruled that there was no evidence of contamination related to the pulp mills. And the ICJ decided that Uruguay had violated some procedural obligations regarding the notification of the construction of these pulp mills, but did not find that the mills were causing significant pollution. In addition, the court ordered both countries to monitor then the environmental impact of the mills. This eventually led to an agreement to establish a binational laboratory, which I love. And this agreement was finally reached in 2016, so 10 years later. And that also shows that sometimes you have to wait until new administrations are in power to come back to the table and sit down and talk about a solution, which might give some of you hope. The goal of this binational lab would be to study not just the pulp mill, but the water quality of the entire river and ecosystem. And the laboratory then serves as an example of a South-South cooperation of science and innovation diplomacy, as it is expected to produce high-quality research in and of itself, in addition to reducing the cost of sending the samples, which up until that point they had sent to a Canadian research lab, was part of the original agreement. So now they're doing that work in-house. This final example I wanted to share, I love very much because it draws on some work of my fellows as they looked at the role of science diplomacy to inform policies to address plastic pollution crisis. So while over 120 countries have implemented bans or taxes on single-use plastics, these measures alone are insufficient to tackle the plastic pollution problem. These regulations mainly target items like plastic bags, which represent a small portion of the plastic waste and are more effective at reducing litter than overall plastic consumption. To address this global issue, the UN Environment Assembly unanimously endorsed a historic resolution called the End Plastic Pollution towards an internationally legally binding instrument. This resolution charges the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to complete an international legal framework focusing on, this is important, the full life cycle of plastics and sustainable consumption. So not just pick it up at the end, but we're looking at the entire life cycle of plastics. And this was put on pause in 2024, but they're really hoping that the countries can come back to put this framework into place in 2025. But they have, I think it's over 70 countries that have already signed on board, and it's called the High Ambition Coalition, which is really interesting. So that's great news. But despite all of these lovely international policy frameworks, the involvement of well-intentioned stakeholders throughout the entire process, the actual implementation of these policies frequently falls short, as we must come to face in reality. And there is this fascinating concept in behavioral science called the intention-action gap, which, as a side note, is another part of what I love about working in TD Science, is that you get to work with so many different experts. So in this group, we had marine biologists working with cognitive neuroscientists to introduce behaviorally aligned practices to policy to try and close that intention-action gap, which is, in the end, the policy intention, which is very good, and how do you change the day-to-day behavior of human beings? Which includes, in this case, establishing clear and achievable goals, breaking down overarching objectives into smaller, more attainable milestones, and ensuring accountability mechanisms are in place to support these messages. This is known as the EAST framework, which means easy, attractive, social, and timely. And so this emerging group of science diplomats in this program, one from Argentina, Jamaica, Brazil, and Canada, applied the EAST framework to plastic pollution reduction efforts within their respective countries to provide an analysis to policymakers and insights on how to have behaviorally aligned policy perspectives, which is an innovative twist on the approach to science. So I've mentioned a couple times the fellows, and I wanted to share how the II is preparing and supporting these emerging leaders working at the multilateral organizations, in the government organizations, and research institutions in our member countries in order to facilitate this cross-border partnerships in the Americas. The STEP program was formed to do just that. We're looking to form these emerging leaders that will be science advisors in their countries. In many countries where we don't have that figure institutionalized in our science and technology and innovation systems. And not just any science advisors, I would say. These are unique because they're really focused on how to put science to service for the development and the sustainable, equitable development of their countries. So that is the professional development program that we provide to our fellows, is based on the 3 pillars of science diplomacy, communication, and transdisciplinary leadership. So causing this shift in how science is perceived and how science is done with non-academic stakeholders, in this case, policymakers. So it's focused in that science policy interface. So the case studies that I've shared and the breakdown of the content that I presented today on science diplomacy is actually pulled from a new online course that we are launching in the next few months, titled Science Diplomacy and Global Environmental Change in the Americas, which will be asynchronous in Spanish, English, and Portuguese, and free, and it comes with a certificate from the University of Sao Paulo. The University of Sao Paulo has been a leader in innovation and science diplomacy for the last few decades, and they have their own innovation science diplomacy school, and do a lot of incredible work. So it was great to work with them in developing this course for the IAI and helping us break down the topic of science diplomacy that's pertinent to the IAI as it relates to global environmental change. And these are the 4 modules of the course, which I beta tested with the fellows this year. An introduction to science diplomacy, and then we talk about innovation diplomacy, negotiation concepts and techniques, and then finally science and innovation diplomacy and global environmental change in the Latin America and the Caribbean, which goes with a case study booklet of over 19 cases. I just shared 3 or 4 with you, but there are over 19 examples from the region of how science diplomacy is being applied for global environmental change from Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is just a brief overview of what we talk about with the fellows in addition to science diplomacy, as we try and align them with work, what it's like to work with an IGO like the IAI, what is the international decision-making process, because they also are finding out what the decision-making process is in each of their host countries. We do communication training focusing on synthesis, and Betty and I were just talking about this over lunch, actually. It's a skill that not all of us have, and I always say that, not every scientist is a communicator, and that's okay, but there are some people who have a really great gift to be communicators, and there are different kind of communicators. Some of us are really good at synthesizing a paper into the top 5 key messages. But that doesn't mean that I'm the best person to then take those key messages and bring it to the mayor and talk to the mayor and catch his attention and follow up with the mayor and get his WhatsApp and say, hey, did you follow up on that? Yes, of course I'm interested in sitting on this technical committee. I'll do whatever you need. And no, I don't know the answer right now, but I know a network of my colleagues who might know, and I can contact and get that information. And what's really great about that is that we're building this network of fellows who they're from the region, right? So whereas before the trend traditionally is to have consultants come in from the UK, from Europe, from Canada, from the United States, but now we're building the experts and the consultants that are coming from next door in Mexico, from Uruguay, from El Salvador, from Guatemala. And that's really powerful too, because it's much more pertinent to, I think, the challenges that we're each focusing. And then we're really hopeful that we're going to bring them all together in Santiago this year for our Transdisciplinary Leadership Conference. And they're working on projects, and I wanted to share some of the topics of the projects that they're doing this year, which includes energy transition, biodiversity and health, language inclusion and science, integrated management of sargassum, the nexus of ocean climate and biodiversity, and then looking at some recommendations from a regional assessment that the IAI did. And each of these topics have been researched ad nauseum, of course, but what they are looking at specifically is the role of science diplomacy in each of these topics, which are of interest to the IAI. So I wanted to share a video with you, which actually has been recirculating quite a bit within the STEP community lately. And I wanted to share it with you today, and then we can close our presentation if I'm on time, or if I'm going way too fast, let me know. Until what time? 1:45. Great.
So it's 15.
Yeah.
So this is the video I need to share before with the Zoom, right?
Yeah, if you stop share, you did. Now share your screen again.
No, I lost. Where is the Zoom?
There
How
should
do I
your
get to the
toolbar
Zoom?
should pop up.
Where is the Zoom? There? Sorry. Oh, sorry.
You're so good. No stress.
There you go. Thank you.
Declaración de liderazgo de los becarios. Preâmbulo. We leaders in science diplomacy, preocupadas e preocupados com as gerações atuais e futuras e com o nosso planeta,
which are affected by structural challenges,
loss of connections among humans and with nature,
por las desigualdades sociales, los modos de vida explotadores y sus impactos en la salud mental,
acknowledging harmful social hierarchies perpetuate injustice, and recognizing the need for transformative and radical change in the Americas, motivados por el deseo de bienestar personal, social y ambiental, inspiradas e inspirados por pessoas que já trabalham para melhorar os modos de vida, interessadas sobre métodos inovadores para generar consenso,
and valuing diversity and collective action,
buscando oportunidades para construir relaciones que hagan audibles las voces ignoradas e encontrem uma base comum. Levem a confiança e equidade.
Declaramos que nos esforzamos por ser oyentes empáticos, empáticas, activos, activas,
And learners with compassion to promote inclusive and collective discussion and decision-making across cultural and national differences.
nos proponemos trabajar constantemente en nuestro autoconocimiento y en la voluntad de ser
Vulnerables, de manera que podamos invocar una mayor confianza y esperanza compartidas a través de las comunidades y de las fronteras. Comprometemos com mudanças transformadoras relevantes para além de incrementar.
by creating and utilizing innovative methods that are flexible to evolving realities,
Fomentamos el reconocimiento de la diversidad de los conocimientos y las sinergias que existen, minimizando monopólios de barreiras do conhecimento y el avance hacia la inclusión colectiva. Aplicamos enfoques transdisciplinarios que fomentan la colaboración,
creando capacidades y soluciones efectivas, transcending limitations of acting and thinking as individual people.
we build trust and equity among societies, mientras abordamos los desafíos más urgentes.
que enfrentan las Américas.
While all differences may not be reconciled, nós nos comprometemos com respeito mútuo and civility for progress.
We strengthen and expand involvement of diverse stakeholders in knowledge,
Innovation and diplomatic action beyond individuals in the IAI, Ciência e Tecnologia and Policy Fellowship Program.
So at the time of writing that,
Drinking warm water
Oh.
before bed balances blood sugar levels and reverses type 2.
I'm so glad it's not my YouTube account. I don't even know what would pop up. It's a mix between PBS and like whatever my kids watching. Ridiculous. So at the time of writing that statement, which took us 3 days, and then they presented it before our executive committee in Uruguay. It was rather stressful, and I have to say that they had gone through the work of creating what was a safe space, because we had very diverse people. And it was amazing to see how, when we introduced the time factor, which was on purpose, because when you're working in the science policy interface, you don't have 3 months to write a publication. You have maybe a day or maybe an hour to respond to a request for information. So this concept of time caused everyone to panic, of course. And then personalities started to come out and things got a little heated. And I was able to see in real life how some of the fellows from the global north were pushing the process because we had to hand it in. And some of the fellows from Latin America were not stopped speaking. They had been very engaged up until then. They stopped speaking. And then it took another fellow from the global north who was observing this as well, said, let's stop. Who cares about the time? Let's take a break for 30 minutes. Let's take a breather. We'll come back in 30 minutes. If it's not ready, it's not ready. And that's the benefit of having it be an exercise, right? But just to say that in the process of putting together this incredible statement, these differences came up, but they had the tools and they had the trust amongst themselves to take a step back and not sacrifice the connection that they had built over the course of all the virtual courses that we had taken and the days that we were finally together. And I have to share that also, it was very emotional delivering this, especially for the fellows from Brazil. Brazil at this point was coming to the end of an administration that had tried very hard and came very close to decimating the scientific community and had huge damage on the environmental resources. And these were people, dedicated researchers who were working in the government, who stuck with it and stayed serving. And when we wrote this, it was at the end of the administration, and the emotional exhaustion that they had was they were able to share that with us, and they were able to work on the statement with us, and then share how important it was to have this global community to support them coming out of something like this. And so I'm sharing this with you now because I have fellows who are part of the TCDsg Science Technology Policy Fellowship Program, all based in DC, and I am getting very heartbreaking messages each week. I know what's happening, and I do not want to be deaf to what's happening here in the United States that has global implications for certain. And if I could say anything right now, that the feeling that I get from the TCD community is very similar to the feeling that I get with the STEP community, and we're just a few years in, what Betty's been building like decades in, right? So please lean on each other as a community in these times and know that there are researchers working in other countries and will continue to work, and the work needs to be done. It's meaningful, it's important. And so lean on your community, put your time in to build that community and find these spaces. We would love to have you find ways to be part of STEP. We would love to find ways to collaborate with TCD and the II and other initiatives that we're doing in 2025 as we all try and navigate these uncertain times. But I know for certain that these communities are really important. And so is going outside as much as you can. Barefoot is possible. So with that, your nuanced interpretation of science and policy, I look forward to sharing these materials with you. The courses, like I said, will be online. I want to share my contact information, and there's our website. And any initiatives that we have coming up, please let me know if you're interested, and I'd be happy to connect with you. Thank you.